Hello, everybody. Hoping we're back from clapping outside. Hi, Marie. Have a little look at my question there. What would you like to see in heaven? That's apart from all the serious stuff. I'm kind of assuming that that's there. So this is going to be a fun question. Um, Plenty of friendly dogs, yeah. So we have in our street, well, in Salisbury Street, which is where everyone seems to be gathering. There's like this big. Now, if you go past petrol stations, they have those kind of full of air, wind blowing tall things that float. It's a little bit like that, like a puppet with a rainbow coloured sort of cloak on it, and it goes up and down the street. It's very exciting. So, yes, we're thinking about what would we like to see in heaven apart from serious stuff, just fun things. So, we've got plenty of friendly dogs, mountains. Yeah, most definitely, and the energy to climb them, Helen. I'm assuming as well. Good evening, Brenda. And Lydia. How many crowns does Barry want, Lydia? What do we reckon? Whole heap of them? Does he have any special ones that he wants? Any particular jewels he wants? Smiling faces, that would be good. Actual real people as well, with smiling faces. The answer to where the chickens keep laying. Is that why we only got 6 eggs today, Martin? Because you couldn't find the other ones? Unlimited chocolate. See, this is why Chloe's on my team, because my version of heaven has like in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the flowing chocolate river. Like, I'm seriously up for a flowing chocolate river, one with like amazing chocolate and no calories. That's what I'm thinking. More mountains. Need some more ideas from you before we keep going. See, Chloe, that's why we're on the same team. Hi, Marilyn. I don't think they have Oompa Loompas in heaven, though, Chloe. Don't know about you. Good evening, Shavinda. Anything else we'd like to see in heaven? A huge drum kit with masses of cymbals and a huge drum screen, Andy, as well. Because we were very happy for you to play your cymbals really, really loudly and have a great time. We were listening to Adrian Plass the other night, and he said that he hopes there's cricket in heaven. I'm not really that bothered about cricket, but I can think of some other things that would be quite nice. Rivers and waterfalls, yeah. You know what I quite like? Fruit trees which have multiple types of fruit on them, and they're always ready. So when you're kind of just wandering around, you think, oh, I just really fancy a pear. It's just there, ready for you. And if you thought to yourself, oh, I'd really like a pomegranate, that would be on the same tree. So you wouldn't have to worry and wander around. You could just have what you wanted right at the same time. I'm just loving the idea of Evelyn with her very large pipe organ and Andy with his huge drum kit with masses of cymbals all at the same time. Marilyn, I'm not sure if that would be wonderful music, but it'd be heaven, so I guess it probably would be. Everything would be in tune and in time. It would just be amazing. That'd be quite cool, wouldn't it? I'm sure there will be wonderful music in heaven. I think we can pretty much guarantee that. So I'm hoping you're in a different mansion from Andy and Evelyn, because it'd be quite noisy in there, I think. Yeah. Yeah. It's going to be fun, isn't it? I wonder what that's going to be like. No, Andy, not dried fruit trees. Fruit salad trees. Choirs of angels, earplugs, yeah. All of those things. Sounds about right. Chloe's just sent a message to our staff team, but I have no understanding of this message, Chloe. I'm just letting you know. No, Rob, no. The mince pie bushes are not to be found in heaven. They are in the other place. Right, are we all ready? Enjoying our slightly mad evening together. So last week we did Numbers chapter 11, and we're going to do a couple of chapters tonight. I'm just reading your comments for the sake of those who aren't on the chat. I like that, Maria. It's good. The ability to enjoy what I don't like now, e.g. bagpipes, so everyone can enjoy what they like. Quite like that. And Andy said that Evelyn is already the perfect organist, and we all agree with that, don't we? Okay, moving on now. We are going to go to a little bit in chapter 12, mostly not chapter 12, but I just thought that we needed just to briefly mention that together. So last week, looking at chapter 11, it was the story of how the people wanted to have meat, and they were fed up with the manna, and eventually God brought them quails, so much that it was absolutely disgusting. And it was all about grumbling and how contagious grumbling is, and how when we grumble, it's like we're saying to God, you don't love me and you haven't got the best for me, and you're not faithful to me. So we talked a lot about grumbling. And obviously we go into chapter 12, and I hope you've got a Bible in front of you. Verse 1, because we thought we'd left all this grumbling in chapter 11. It says, Miriam and Aaron began to talk against Moses because of his Cushite wife, for he had married a Cushite. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses, they asked. Hasn't he also spoken through us? And the Lord heard this. And if you remember in chapter 11 and verse 1, it again says, now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord, and when he heard them, his anger was aroused. It's kind of a bit of a warning, isn't it, really? It's a bit of a warning to us that God hears the things that we say to each other. I think it's in Malachi, it says about the fact that they talk together about the Lord, and the Lord heard them and he loved that. But actually here it's about the fact that they're talking negatively, as in chapter 11 verse 1, and God hears them. And you know what, I quite like to think that God only hears things selectively. I quite like to choose what he hears. So it's fine when I'm praying about something to him directly that I want him to hear. I'm less enthusiastic about him hearing the things that I'm saying that I don't want him to hear. I'm sure you feel the same way. But Miriam and Aaron, they talked against Moses. And in this first 2 verses of this chapter, we have a whole bunch of different things. First of all, we have this kind of more contagious grumbling thing going on, that it feels like it's just got a hold in the camp, and they've kind of caught on to it as well, Miriam and Aaron. And then we have, racism, really, because they talk against him because of his wife, because he's married to a Cushite, which is just an interesting kind of thing, isn't it? But there's a kind of a racist element to their conversation here. And then there's also kind of sibling rivalry, which of course is extremely normal, isn't it? And we see it here with Miriam and Aaron. Has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us? And we really kind of identify with that, don't we? When we're in a kind of situation where maybe we just feel a bit put out, or somebody else is getting more attention than we are, and we see it with siblings all of the time, even into adulthood. In fact, we just have that same kind of jostling for attention or for first place. It's very normal kind of behavior. But this is with the same story with Miriam and Aaron. They're just like, oh, this isn't fair. It's not just about Moses. And anyway, we all know that Moses was the one who wasn't very good at speaking, and said he wasn't really competent, and couldn't Aaron go instead? But now it's all about Moses, and they're less happy with that. And there's also pride, which is, of course, at the root of everything, really. All of our attention seeking or competitiveness or all that kind of stuff, wanting to put ourselves in the center. It's all about pride. And so we see, even in 2 verses, all these different kind of issues that they've got. And the Lord heard them. So this wasn't like a private conversation on the side. God actually heard them. And then there's a kind of a few verses here where I just went, oh my goodness. So verse 3, now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. I mean, that's just like a wow verse, isn't it? Because, well, whatever we think about Moses, and we know quite a lot about him, that's quite some striking comment to make, that Moses was very humble, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. And yeah, maybe that's something that we'd like to have said about us, isn't it? That there's something about integrity there and the right position before God. And then it says, at once the Lord said to Moses, Aaron and Miriam, come out to the tent of the meeting, all 3 of you. So the 3 of them came out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud. He stood at the entrance to the tent and summoned Aaron and Miriam. When both of them stepped forward, he said, listen to my words. And here is another kind of couple of verses where I just went, oh my goodness. When a prophet of the Lord is among you, I reveal myself to him in visions, I speak to him in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? Again, it's just a really startling sense that Moses is set apart. He's really different. That there's something really quite unique about Moses, because of his faithfulness and because of the way that God's called him. He actually speaks with him face to face, and we know that that's true. And he sees the form of God at a time when they believed that if they saw God, they would die. And we know from earlier on in this book, around the holiness of God, that people did die for not respecting the holiness of God and the holiness of the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. And yet here's Moses, so humble, and yet the only person who God speaks to face, and who actually sees something of the form of the presence of God. So then it says, the anger of the Lord burned against them, and he left them. When the cloud lifted from above the tent, there stood Miriam, leprous like snow. Aaron turned towards her and saw that she had leprosy. And he said to Moses, please, my Lord, do not hold against us the sin we have so foolishly committed. And so on. And we just have this judgment from God on this complaining, grumbling, their kind of pride and their comments and their rivalry and their lack of respect for Moses. And Aaron he repents. Actually, he immediately recognizes what has happened, and he turns around and he repents, and he's just regretful as well. And Moses actually also, there's still that kind of, I guess there's a love for his brother and sister, and he cries out to God to heal them. And the consequence of that is that she is healed, but there is a consequence. She has to be outside of the camp for 7 days, and the people couldn't move on until she returned back to the camp again. So I didn't want to just totally ignore that story, because that's kind of the backdrop for this next bit. And yet again, they're delayed. So they start in this place, Kibroth Hatava, which means the graves of craving, which is a great name, isn't it? And then they went to Hazeroth, and then they're waiting there again because of this incident with Miriam and Aaron. And then after that, they camp in the desert of Paran. And here we come to chapter 13, which is probably the best known chapter out of the whole of the book of Numbers. And so we're going to have a little look at that together. One of the things that someone... Yeah, I know, Evelyn, I just thought that as well. Why didn't Aaron get struck with leprosy as well? I don't know. I don't know. Anybody else know the answer to that question? Seems a little bit unfair, doesn't it? I don't know. Somebody said about healthy churches, um, that healthy churches are those who embark on a journey of faith. And I think that's probably right, because faith is about um, trusting God, isn't it? And it's about taking faith-filled risks. And actually, this chapter speaks quite a lot into that. And it's also about one of the greatest tragedies in the history of Israel. Um, Chapter 13, they're poised to take the promised land. And by the end of chapter 14, they're doomed to death in the desert. So just 2 chapters, and it goes from the brightest vision of what's ahead to some kind of desperation, really, because of their faithlessness, because they let fear get the better of them, and their fear led to failure. And when we allow unbelief to dominate our thinking, then we start to fall into doubt, and then we start to face the obstacles and the problems in our lives, and we lose trust and we stop moving forward. And sometimes there's tragic consequences for that. But there's also hope in this chapter, that we could take another path, that there is another option, that our story doesn't have to be the same as the people of Israel. So we're going to read together quite a big chunk. So I hope that's all right with you, but it's a good story and it's good for us to read it. So chapter 13 says, "The Lord said to Moses, send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe send one of its leaders." So at the Lord's command, Moses sent them out from the desert of Paran. All of them were leaders of the Israelites. And then we'll jump down to verse 17. "When Moses sent them to explore Canaan, he said, go up through the Negev and on into the hill country. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees on it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. It was the season for the first ripe grapes." So they went up and explored the land from the desert of Zin as far as Rehob towards Lemo Hamath. They went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, lived. Hebron had been built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. When they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates, there we go again, Chloe, and figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut off there. At the end of 40 days, they returned from exploring the land. Okay. They came back to Moses and Aaron and the whole Israelite community at Kadesh in the desert of Paran. There they reported to them and to the whole assembly and showed them the fruit of the land. They gave Moses this account. "We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan." Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." That night, all the people of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in the desert. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will swallow them up. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." But the whole assembly talked about stoning them. And the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, how long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the miraculous signs I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them, but I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than I. And then we have Moses pleading with God. He pleads with God, and he says, you can't do this because the Egyptians are going to hear about it, and then it's going to be dishonoring to you. And eventually God relents, sort of, and says, yeah, okay, I won't wipe them all out right now this second, but actually only Joshua and Caleb are going to enter the promised land. And so, do you remember back at the beginning, chapter 1, we did a census count, and that was a reason for great confidence for them. There were 600,000 fighting men over the age of 20, and then everybody else as well. But that census count, by the time we get to chapter 14 and verse 31 onwards, is going to become a body count. Because of those 600,000 men, only 2 of them entered into the promised land. So here's some little interesting conversation going on the side here about why it was only Miriam and not Aaron who was covered with leprosy. So Rob, I like your thinking there. Maybe God was being practical. Aaron was wearing all the priestly garments, and those would need to all be cleansed again too. Great. Andy, so that Aaron could repent on his and Miriam's behalf. Yeah. Miriam also needed a priest to be present to identify the leprosy. And then Simon said maybe God was being gracious. So, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Maybe that's something that you guys could have a look up. I think all of those thoughts are good ones. And come back next week and tell me the answer. So we're going to carry on now. So what happened here in this story? I think it's most of you on the chat are going to be really familiar with this story. But it really happened, didn't it? Because of unbelief. Unbelief. They failed to trust God and to take that journey of faith together. And they allowed their sinful hearts to get the best of them. And verse 17 to 20, they're told by Moses to go into Canaan and to have a look. It's not like go in blind. Assess it. Moses says, go and see what the land's like. He says, go and see what the people are like. Martin Lee, I think your commentary comes from a reformed tradition. Martin says it suggests that Miriam was the main complainer. That's not what it says in the text. They said, see what the people are like. See if they're strong or weak. What kind of towns they live in. Are they walled or fortified, or are they okay? What's the soil like? So Moses says, go and scout it out. Go and take a really good look at the land and the people there. Be prepared for what you've got ahead of you. But in the end, after we've read this passage, we find this real simple thing here, which was that they stopped trusting God. They stopped trusting God because of tall people. Okay, that's fundamentally what it says, is they stopped trusting God, even though everything about the land was amazing. They stopped trusting God because of tall people. Verse 27 and 28. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. Here is its fruit. But the people who live there are powerful, and they're really tall. And it's kind of a bit sad, isn't it, that just because the people were tall, they gave up on trusting God for everything that he had put in front of them. And yet it does make you ask the question, doesn't it? How many times do we not walk into the things that God has for us, and have people not walked in to the visions and dreams that God has for them because of tall people, because of something or someone who just feels like a giant to them and makes them just think, well, I can't do that then. And so it doesn't matter how brilliant everything else is, how wonderful, how much it feels and looks like God is involved in it, this tall person is there, and you kind of go, "Oh, I can't do it now because there's a tall person there." Because there's something that just stands in my way, and I can't imagine myself getting through that. And they did say that the cities are fortified and very large, and archaeologists have said that some of the settlement walls of the towns in Canaan might well have been 30 to 50 feet high and around 15 feet wide. So it was going to be challenging. And in the story of Joshua, we know that at least one of those cities was the city of Jericho, and they had to walk around it once a day for 7 days, and seven times on the final day, and blow their trumpets, and then the walls came down. But clearly that was true. The cities were well protected. But really the main thing here is that the people were tall. We can't attack those people. They are stronger than us. We saw the descendants of Anak. The land we explored devours those living it. All the people we saw are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim. I am certain that not everyone that they saw was really, really tall. But I think they just saw some people who were tall and strong, and they just allowed it to get into their mind and into their heart. And, whenever something scares or intimidates us, or threatens maybe an idea or vision that we have from God, it's really easy, isn't it, to just become fixated on that one thing, or that one person, and they just become bigger and bigger and bigger in our thoughts and imagination, and we become smaller and smaller. And there's this really famous verse, isn't there? Verse 33, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them. They just, I don't know what the perspective is between the size of a grasshopper and a human being, but it's a huge difference, isn't it? A size ratio. And I'm certain that the people of Israel were not relatively as small as a grasshopper compared to the size of the people who lived in the promised land. But that's how they'd begun to imagine it. That's how small they'd made themselves and how big they'd made the enemy. And grasshoppers were the smallest edible creatures of the time. So they kind of, like we used to use as a term of abuse, oh, they're like a shrimp or something like that. They're a little shrimp. And it was a bit like they were saying that we're a little shrimp, and they're huge. And it's kind of got the posh version here. The land we explore devours those living it. And they're kind of basically saying they're going to eat us alive, or they're going to eat us for breakfast. We just can't do this. They're just totally obsessed by these tall people. And so they ignore everything else that God has provided for them, including God's promise to them and the fact that God is with them. And so these tall people are not such a big issue, really. And so in the end, it's just Joshua and Caleb, which is interesting, isn't it? Out of all the names, I know I didn't read the names, but I had a look at them earlier on. Joshua and Caleb are the only names that we still call our children. All the other names have just, I don't know whether they're used in Hebrew for Hebrew children, but they're definitely Israeli children. They're just definitely not used commonly. Only Joshua and Caleb, which says something, doesn't it? Only Joshua and Caleb said, we can do this. Everyone else was saying, no, we can't. And only Joshua and Caleb said, we can. And it's interesting, it reminded me of Barack Obama's presidential campaign some years ago, where basically the main slogan was, yes, we can, because I think there's something really important about people who have a degree of confidence that's not just a fairy tale version of confidence. But for Joshua and Caleb, their confidence was in God and in his promises, and they were saying, listen up, yes, we can do this, we definitely can do this. And they were encouraging the others, don't rebel, don't shrink back, because we can do this. But of course they weren't listening, and the vast majority were not listening. They weren't listening to the voices of faith. They were only listening to the doubt and unbelief. And they were just saying continually, "We see tall people. We see tall people." And Joshua and Caleb were saying, "No, but it's the promised land. It's flowing with milk and honey. Look at all the grapes. Look at all the wonderful things we saw. Look at the fact that God is with us. We see tall people." And unbelief always does see tall people. It always sees the obstacles rather than the Lord. And I was reminded again last week when I was talking about something else, a different context of the image of the solar eclipse. You know, where the moon, which is relatively small, entirely blocks out the unbelievable, indescribable brightness of the sun, just because it gets in that place in our vision. And that's what happens, isn't it, when we allow obstacles, whatever our particular obstacle is, um, to get in the way of God, because God is taller than the tallest person. He is big, and we we mustn't forget that. And unbelief looks at everything except the Lord. It looks at the enemy, it looks at the problem, it looks at the challenge, it looks at everybody else except for the Lord. Um, I was thinking about how perspective can change, and it reminded me again of when Mike and I were traveling in Central America, and this is where mostly all my good stories come from. And before we'd gone there, we were reading up on a number of the countries in Central America, and one of them is Guatemala. And reading on all sorts of different blogs, and I don't know if they had blogs then, but anyway, various information about Guatemala. It was quite a scary place to go, and there'd been a spate of groups of travellers or tourists, whichever, being rounded up at gunpoint on official tours. So people had signed up and gone on an official tour, and then they'd been in collaboration with some gangs or just not so nice people, and they'd be rounded up at gunpoint, and some of the men had been shot, some of the women had been raped, and there was a number of these stories. And of course, when you're at home in England, that feels incredibly frightening and intimidating, and I was really, really uncertain that I really wanted to go to Guatemala at all. There's plenty of other countries, and of course, all of the other ones were perfectly safe, apart from Guatemala, which is clearly not true. But I'd begun to build up this picture in my mind of what Guatemala was going to be like, and I really was very anxious about it, really. And then we traveled through Mexico, and we traveled down into Belize. And we managed to get ourselves caught in Hurricane Mitch, which was at that point the fifth biggest hurricane ever recorded. And so we got trapped in Belize. And eventually, after quite some time of being there and being trapped and not being able to get away, we managed to get a flight, which is a whole other story in itself. Anyway, several flights, in fact. And we eventually got a flight, and the place we got to go to was Guatemala. And I have to say that getting out of the plane into Guatemala became a huge sense of relief, and our perspective completely changed, because what we'd done was we'd got out of a more frightening situation into a country that seemed relatively safe to us, and which we really actually loved being in. We loved Guatemala. And it just shows you how your perspective of something can change if you look at it from a different angle. And often when we look at situations, we fixate on something, and probably depending a little bit on our personality type, or perhaps it depends on the situation. Sometimes we fixate on the things that are terrifying about something, and sometimes we fixate more on the opportunity and the experience and all the positive things about it. And so I don't know what that might be for you tonight. I don't know what you might be thinking about as the way ahead, where you feel like you have a choice of either looking to the Lord and having confidence in him, or looking at the tall people. Maybe it might be some kind of sense of calling that you have for something that God wants you to do in your life. Maybe it's something about looking at your finances going forward and just thinking, I have no idea how this is all going to work out right now because it seems really scary and there's a whole lot of tall people around. And yet God is saying, no, it's okay, I'm with you, I'm for you. Maybe it's some kind of past situation or sin in your life and it's just blocking your vision of God, and you can't see through it. It's just always a distraction to you. It feels like a tall person to you, and you need to know that God is bigger than that, and He is able to forgive and to cleanse you from that. There's just all manner of things that we can allow to become like the tall person that prevent us from walking into all the things that God has got for us. And it reminded me of one of my favourite stories, which is Pilgrim's Progress, and it reminded me of when Christian and Hopeful, his companion, went off the path because they thought it was an easier way, and they ended up in Doubting Castle, which of course was ruled by giant Despair and his wife, who I think was called Diffidence or something like that. And it's so easy for us to be on the right path, going in the right direction, and there's something distracts us and we just head off in a different direction, and before we know it, we're caught up in doubt or despair or just indifference, and we've let something else take us away from the purpose of God for us. And Joshua and Caleb just kept on trying, even with the people who were just whinging and complaining, and you can hardly believe it, can you? Like, beginning of chapter 14, if only we'd died in Egypt or in the desert. So last week they were complaining about the fact that they couldn't go back to Egypt and they didn't have enough to eat. Now they think that it would have been better if they died. Why is God bringing us into this land only for us to fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And then, we're going to choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. And still Joshua and Caleb are saying, come on, guys, let's get a good perspective on this. The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. I always think of Mr. Kipling when I think of that verse. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only don't rebel against the Lord. Don't be afraid of the people of the land, because we will swallow them up. It's like the same idea as they're going to devour us, except that Joshua and Caleb are saying, no, actually, it's the other way around. We're going to swallow them up. Not they're going to devour us, but we're going to swallow them up. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. I don't think they could have given a more inspiring kind of rallying cry to the people, could they? But the people weren't listening. They just weren't listening. They just couldn't hear it. And I think, what God says in verse 11 is brilliant. How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the miraculous signs I have performed among them? You just have this, I don't know if God's allowed to get fed up, but I kind of feel that he definitely is quite fed up at this point. I've done all this for them, and yet they still can't trust me. They still don't believe what I've told them. I've got them out of Egypt by a whole bunch of different miracles. I've provided for them in the desert by a whole bunch of different miracles. And then as soon as there's tall people, they stop believing in me anymore. Well, there's an opposite to tall people, really, and it's not small people, by the way. It's fat grapes is the opposite, isn't it, really? When we look in chapter 13 and verse 20, it says, how is the soil? Is it fertile, poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land. It was the season for the first ripe grapes. And then in verse 23, when they reached the valley of Eshcol, which means cluster, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. Two of them carried it on a pole between them, along with some pomegranates and figs. Can you imagine what size the grapes were if they cut off a cluster of grapes and it took two of them to carry it? Like the ones that we buy from Aldi do not need two people carrying them on a pole. I don't know about the ones that you have. It's interesting that Moses says something about the grapes, and then they find these amazing grapes. And it's like the grapes were a sign of God's care for them, of God's provision, of what He had in store for them. They'd been living on manna and quail, and now all of this was in front of them. These huge grapes, um, and pomegranates and figs and milk and honey. Just so much luxury and opportunity for them. And they had this opportunity to focus on that, um, and to claim God's promises and to enter the promised land. But they just couldn't do it, could they? They couldn't do it. And I think it's really, really challenging, actually. I don't think we ever need to be reminded to look at the tall people. I think that we're kind of, our predisposition for most of us is to look at the distraction things, the things that are threatening, the obstacles, the things that are going to make it difficult. But most of us need to be reminded about the fat grapes, don't we? We need to be reminded. Um, Grace, what is your mum singing? How sweet they sound. How sweet? I'm just really interested to know what your mum's just started singing. It's fascinating. You need to tell me. You need to tell me now. We need to be encouraged to pay attention to the signs of God's faithfulness. Oh, thanks for that, Gail. Amazing grapes. That's excellent. Thank you. We're going to have that run through our minds now all night, aren't we? Amazing grapes. How sweet. We need to be encouraged to keep attention to his faithfulness, because as I've said before a few times, I think the opposite of faith is forgetfulness, I think. Because forgetfulness allows us to let doubt and unbelief start to take the place in our minds. Whereas when we remember God's faithfulness and his goodness and his presence and his protection, then our faith levels start to rise and we start to trust him for the things that seem challenging ahead of us. And so I come back to that kind of phrase I started with, which is healthy churches embark on a journey of faith. And some of that is around seeing God's provision. It's about knowing his faithfulness, about remembering that he is good and his love endures forever, and that he is always faithful and that he provides. And, you know, for our church, that has been our story. It is our story. And so when we're faced with another kind of challenge, another faith challenge to us as a church, which frankly this whole experience right now feels a bit like, then what do we do? Do we look at the tall people? Do we look at the things that are fearful and uncertain and unsettling and threatening? Or do we keep our eyes on the fat grapes that God has brought his church through many, many trials and challenges over many centuries, and that nothing is too much for him? And so we can trust him. And maybe that means that we have to have a bit more patience than I was planning on having this year. But maybe, not maybe, but I'm sure he does have a purpose in it all. And our job is to keep trusting what his purpose is, what his timing is, what he's doing in this period of time that he couldn't be doing if we didn't have this period of time, what he's working in us and through us, what new opportunities are rising for us, and to kind of look forward to what he has for us in the next experience of our journey of walking with him. And that takes a bit of courage, doesn't it? because I don't know about you, but I was reasonably happy with how the year was panning out, and now it's not doing that anymore. And there's a courage to keep going, to keep focused on him, to keep focused on the things that he's called us to. It's a challenge for us to keep our vision on him and on the things that we know that he's called us to as a church. And one of the things we're going to be talking about, not this Sunday coming, but the one after, is around a little bit around the whole mental health, anxiety scenario that this is bringing about at the moment, and which is going to be something that grows over these next months ahead, as people feel anxious about finance and work and health and all sorts of other things, the general state of the economy and the world. One of our visions for the house is a place where people can be safe to be how they are, and where it's okay to not be okay, where we draw alongside people and we talk about well-being, and we have a place where that is a really significant part of our ministry. That vision only ever grows for us, and we have to trust God's timing in that and keep focused on the things that he has for us and all that he's provided for us, because we have great confidence in God. He has provided for us in miraculous ways, far beyond our expectations, in terms of people and finance and opportunity. God provides for us so amazingly, and we can have confidence in him. And so it's just something to keep on focusing on the signs of his faithfulness, and just simply to say, where he goes, we will go. And so the next step for us right now is a very still step. It doesn't feel like we're going anywhere in the normal scheme of things. But at the moment, we're all dispersed, we're all scattered, we're learning how to do church in our homes, separately in our families, together, but not gathered in the same place, but scattered. It's an opportunity for us as the church across the nation. When I think it's 1 in 4 people are Googling prayer, more people are have tried out some kind of church online than at any time in the past decades. Here's an amazing opportunity of God preparing his people for the next stage. And we need to keep on looking to him and not looking at the tall people, because at the end of the day, where he goes, that's where we go, isn't it? When he moves on, then we move on. Wherever he leads us, that's where we should be going. And that's not the place for us to be saying, oh no, let's go back. Let's go back to Egypt. We liked it there, actually, because we've forgotten the things that we didn't like. It's always about going forward into the things that God has for us. And as Andy says, the grapes are foretaste of what is to come, of heaven, where Jesus says he'll share the fruit of the vine with those who love him in his kingdom. And we've talked about the kind of slightly wacky ideas of what we think that heaven will be like. But this promised land they went to is just the beginning. It's just an idea of what is to come when we get to be in the presence of the Lord forever and ever and ever. And maybe when we're there and we're totally captivated by his presence, maybe I won't be so bothered about whether we've got a chocolate river or not. Or maybe I will. I don't know. But it just feels like heaven will be everything that's the best of what God provides for us. Of course, most of all, that's his presence without sin. But why would you create mountains on earth and not have them in heaven, or rivers or waterfalls? Yeah. So it's just keeping on, isn't it, really? And being more like Joshua and Caleb than all the others. And Caleb's name means wholehearted. I'm sure you know that. But we want to be like him, don't we? Wholehearted in our pursuing of God and his promises for us. So when it's a choice of looking at tall people or fat grapes, make sure you choose the fat grapes. Okay, everybody, that's all for tonight. Stay well, stay safe. Look forward to seeing you on Sunday morning. 10 o'clock and also 11:15 as well. And we're on 1 Kings 18, the second half of that, this Sunday morning, and looking forward to sharing that with you all. I think that's about everything there is to say tonight. So look after yourselves, and it's nice to see you. See you again very soon. Oh, one more thing. I put this at the top of my pad and I have forgotten. Today is Brenda's birthday, so we are going to sing happy birthday. So are you all ready? Okay. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Brenda. Happy birthday to you. Hope you've had a really nice day, Brenda. Happy birthday. Oh, it's Eileen's birthday too. Sorry, Helen, I didn't realise that. Happy birthday, Eileen. Hope you've had a brilliant day as well.